transcription. So if you would not want to be recorded, feel free to turn off your camera, but just want to let you know that this session will be recorded. And so like I've shared, welcome to our first session for the International Colloquium this year, kicking off, starting off with a great session. And so super excited to have everyone join us today. So this year, our colloquium theme is Reimagining Social Justice in the Intersectional Community, Intersectionality Beyond Intersecting Identities. And our first session here today is on Complicating International Student Support, Historical Perspectives and Contemporary Issues within the US Higher Education. We'll be introducing our speakers in a little bit. And so, but there are just a few information we would like to share with you. So this colloquium is hosted by the Commission for Global Dimensions of Student Development. I'm currently, like I've shared, my name is Yuan Zhou. My English pronouns are she, her, hers. I currently serve as the past chair for the commission. But our commission is with ACPA, and it is an entity that focuses on, cross-cultural learning, development of intercultural competencies, internationalization, and student services around the world. And we're also home for foreign-born international student affairs professionals living in the US, and also just higher education professionals working outside of the US. So we're home to these lovely folks as well. And just for, just gonna share this information in the Dropbox. We will also be giving out certificate for folks attending our colloquium. So stay until the end if you wanted to learn how you can be eligible for doing so. And next slide, please. Okay. And related to ACPA missions of supporting and fostering learning through the generation sharing of knowledge, our commission would also like to acknowledge the land that each of us occupies today. And since we are everywhere, right? We are all at different locations. We would like to invite you to check out this website that I'll also be dropping in the chat below, to check out this website for you to be able to share where you are, the ancestral homelands that you are occupying today. And so as we do introduction, feel free to include that into your introduction as well. And so with that being said, as you learn about our presenters, we would like to learn about you. So if you could introduce yourself in the chat box with the following information, that would be lovely. So we can see, who is in the house with us today. And yeah, so keep that coming. We'll be getting started with our first session right now. So I'll hand off to Tay.
Hello, everyone. My name is Yishuan Tay. I go by Tay. I use she, her pronouns. I'm currently a member at large with the Commission for Global Dimensions of Student Development. And we are so excited to bring you today's, our first session of this year's International Colloquium series. And it's my pleasure to introduce and invite our esteemed speakers who are researchers within international higher education. First, we have Dr. Christina Yao, uses she, her pronouns, and is currently a professor at the University of South Carolina. We are also joined by Dr. Santiago Castiello, uses he, him pronouns, and currently works at the Consortium of North American Higher Education Collaboration. And finally, we have Xiaojie Li, who uses she, her pronouns. And we just found out today that she's joining us from Taiwan today. So it's almost 11 p.m. for her. It is 11 p.m. for her right now. But she's a current graduate student, a PhD student at the University of Arizona. And with that said, I'll pass it off to Dr. Yao.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tay, and thank you everyone for being here, and a big thank you to the ACPA CGDSD. I always have to look at that and remember the acronym. We're really excited to be here. So thank you to all of you, especially coming in from very different, from multiple time zones. So it's exciting to be here. And ACPA actually was my first professional home as a student affairs professional. So it's really nice to be here to talk a little bit about some of the research that I've been doing and everything. So with this first slide, so what I want to start with is, as we think about reflecting on and discussing our topic today, right, which is really focused on the historical perspective, as well as contemporary issues that are affecting international students in U.S. higher education, I wanted to briefly share a framework that my colleague, Dr. Crystal George Mwangi and I created. It's called the Equity-Driven Lens for Internationalization. So if you take a look at this, it's really meant to serve as a tool for magnifying equity and the inequity in higher education internationalization. We identified 4 guiding principles of our lens because although internationalization is increasingly a strategic priority within higher ed, growing scholarship demonstrates that internationalization practices such as education abroad and international student recruitment can engender Western superiority, elitism, and hegemony. Conversely, an equity-driven lens assumes that education institutions and their processes are not neutral. And thus it's really important for us to be intentional about putting equity at the center of our practice. So if you take a look at this illustration, you'll see what we actually sat around for a while and tried to figure out like, what kind of a figure do we want to do, all of that. And I don't even know how this came to us, but we're like, oh my gosh, it's like a piece of yarn, right? So if you look at how it's magnified, we use a piece of yarn as a metaphor for illustrating the internationalization of higher education. When we think about yarn, we often think about it as one thread, right? We think about it's just one thread that we use for knitting, for crocheting, whatever we want to do. Just as internationalization is often thought about a single broad umbrella term that can overshadow its complexities. But when you look closer, yarn is actually made up of multiple strands of tightly interlocked fibers. And so for us, we're like, oh, this is a great metaphor for internationalization practices because of the interconnectedness of multiple complex processes, policies, practices, people, communities, and organizations. What I also want to highlight is you can kind of see up to the upper right side, you see 4 lenses there, right? And so we really have 4 guiding principles that we really use and we highlight about how we can use that to magnifying internationalization and the equity or the inequity presented within. Also, by the way, if you are interested in a copy of this chapter, it is very long, but I'm happy to send it to you. I know this is going publicly, but don't pay for it. Just email me, I'm happy to send it to you. All right, next slide. And also throughout this presentation, if you have questions or anything comes up, pop it in the chat and we'll get to that as soon as we get to the end, all right? So as I said, we have these 4 guiding principles or lenses, and we use them to organize how we want to think about equity or inequity in internationalization practices. And I'm going to use this to organize the rest of my part of the presentation. And throughout my unpacking of the lens, I'm also going to give a few examples related to international student mobility in the US, particularly since that is relevant to our topic today. Next slide. And so our first lens is about defining the socio-historical context. And so the United States has always been a site of internationalization, globalization, colonization, and the domination of people, land, and ideas. Current research and practice cannot be divorced from social and historical events and ideologies that continue to inform contemporary approaches to international education. So scholar practitioners can pursue equitable approaches to internationalization practices by considering the socio-historical context and, more importantly, how these contexts serve as foundations for current challenges and opportunities affecting international students. So in the next slide, what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about, again, how to apply the framework, right? So I want to share a little bit about the U.S. historical context of racism that obviously continues to impact our society today, as well as where international students enter into that context in contemporary times. And so we really can't talk about race and racism in the past few years without connecting to Asian history in the United States, which really began with the arrival of Chinese and Japanese immigrants, primarily for labor reasons, settling on the West Coast. Arrival caused a lot of, elicited a lot of racism and hostility from white Americans that at the time, due to perceived employment competition, included discrimination from the US government. And so ultimately, Asian people in the United States represented the yellow peril, which refers to the fear and distrust of Asian individuals that categorizes Asians as forever foreigners. And we know that in the past few years, we've really seen a rise of this in the past couple of years in the wake of the pandemic and everything. And so in thinking about the socio-historical perspective of, why is there so much anti-Asian hate, right? It's not anything new, and it's not necessarily anything new even within the context of a pandemic. It's more like it's a chronic issue that we've had woven within the socio-historical foundations of this country and everything. And so which has led to, a lot of the issues that have happened. And we know, especially a lot of our Asian or perceived to be Asian students have experienced a lot of discrimination, racism during the pandemic. And so in the next slide, so that was one example. So in the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about the next lens, which is connecting to contemporary forces of globalization. What we know is that internationalization practices are heavily driven by global structures and systems that privilege the needs of what may be considered the global north. This is particularly relevant today because we push against the idea that process of internationalization is often compartmentalized as US domestic priorities that are disconnected from global issues, which we know is a disservice in current research, theory, and practice. Thus, scholar practitioners must take into consideration how contemporary forces of globalization can affect research, policies, and practices related to international student mobility. And in the next slide, to illustrate the forces of globalization, we can use immigration as an example. We've seen so many iterations of policies and laws that directly affect international students in the United States, often feeling many feelings of trauma and insecurity. Even in the past 3 years, we've seen an expansion of travel bans from predominantly Muslim countries. And then in July 2020, July 7th, 2020, I will always remember that date because that's actually my birthday. A policy that was later rescinded was announced that international students could not be in the US and remain as fully online students, even within the wake of a pandemic. We saw proclamations that suspended entry from certain countries due to risk of COVID transmission. And we all know that the proclamations banning entry were not equal across the world, right? Across the globe, and what the United States chose to do. And so even in thinking about international student mobility to the United States, we know that the forces of globalization, including its connections to privileges based on national origin, were really illuminated in the COVID pandemic. In the next slide, I'm going to talk about the third lens, which is deconstructing or constructing internationalization. And we have to really think about the language that we use in internationalization and the meaning ascribed to that language, whether explicitly stated or implicitly assumed. It really has the power to shape how people and practices are understood, right? Especially in practice, policy, and in research. So I encourage scholar practitioners to move beyond these implicit assumptions and engage in greater nuance in how internationalization, or the terminology, is constructed toward the goal of equity-driven scholarship and practice. The overarching idea is to question who gets to decide what counts and who counts as internationalization on an individual campus, rather than accept the status quo of what is included, excluded, or defined. And in doing so, scholars can move toward the construction of internationalization in research and practice that works to resist inequity in higher education. So in the next slide, an example of that is relating it to international students and the lack of acknowledgement of how international students are raced in the US context within university practice and even in early research that has been conducted by scholars. Deconstructing why that occurs and engaging in research that reconstructs their experiences as racialized and race is one way to address this issue. International students come to the US from over 200 countries, but we often construct international students' experiences by generalizing for all international students as if they reflect a homogenous group. So for example, in many national and institutional data sets, the demographic data about these students rarely go beyond their foreign status. So as scholar practitioners, we must pay greater attention to how we can humanize the people, right? Think about beyond just the numbers, how we often use to address international students on our campuses. And finally, in the final lens, in the next slide, an equity-driven research and practice orientation really guides scholar practitioners away from grounding their work in ways that reinforce internationalization as a values neutral or a positive overly positive process. There's positive to it, right? I mean, I don't want to come into this and be like, oh, this is all negative and it's all doom and gloom. There is a lot of positive, but it's not indiscriminately positive. And so one way to counteract values neutrality is through the use of conceptual and theoretical perspectives that enable us to critique and disrupt inequity, hegemony, and marginalization that occurs within higher ed internationalization, as well as to identify and engage in resistance of inequity and to reimagine internationalization. So in this final lens, we ask that we grapple with not only what does internationalization mean, but how do we frame campus problems to combat inequity? And so the next slide is just a quick overview of an article that I co-wrote with some colleagues. We applied critical race theory to understanding the international student experience. And a lot of the earlier research related to international students, racism was not really always considered in their experiences, right? Usually racism, when we talked about it in higher ed scholarship, was about US racially minoritized students. The emphasis on international students was always more on, are they integrating, right? Which we also know that integration is a problematic concept. But it talked about a lot of integration, assimilation, and psychology-based frameworks that were focused on coping, which can really silence experiences with racism, neo-racism, and racist nativism. And so within this article, we use critical race theory because what's helpful with that is that we can understand the experiences in the US because of the racialization they may experience within and by US higher education institutions. And so we argue that a stronger emphasis must be played on international student mobility to the US from a systems perspective, right? So it's not just about the individual student coming in, but from a systematic perspective, and that CRT can lend to this perspective due to its emphasis on countering systems of white supremacy and claims of meritocracy that impact the lives of international students, particularly those who might be identified as international students of color on US predominantly white campuses. And so in using CRT, it allowed us a framing for investigating the privileged positioning of white American values and explicitly name the racialized context of the United States. Again, if you're interested in this article, let me know. Don't pay for it. I will send it to you. And the next slide. So very quickly, I just went through the 4 principles of an equity-driven lens for internationalization very quickly because I want to get to the other presenters. I have amazing things to talk about also. But a really quick review of the lens again. And as indicated by these examples that I gave, it's imperative that we approach internationalization and equity work together, right? For a long, long time, it's always been very, very separate. That on our campuses, when we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, that's one office, one population of people that do that. When we talk about internationalization and global perspective, another office and everything. But we've really got to talk about this together because higher education is really rooted in those historical foundations of race, coloniality, and nativism, which affect a lot of the things that we do around the globe. And that's evidenced by this thread of yarn, right? That internationalization and equitable approaches in higher education cannot be separated from each other, and that intertwining is necessary for addressing issues of racism, coloniality, and xenophobia in global higher education, which are greatly affecting a lot of the international students on our campuses in the United States. All right, so now I will pass it over to Dr. Castillo, who will go into further detail about the commodification and dehumanization of international students on our campuses.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yao. And good morning, everyone. My name is Santiago Castillo, and I'm coming to you live from the unceded territory of the Tohono O'odham and Pascua Yaqui people, what's currently known as Tucson, Arizona. And as a former international student myself, I would like to share with you a little bit about ways in which, despite the best intentions, higher education institutions in the United States are commodifying and dehumanizing international students. And what can we do about it? And how can we engage better international students in our campuses and change a little bit the discourse and the narrative around international students? So first of all, like why do we all as student affairs practitioners, as international affairs practitioners, should care about international students' experiences? Well, I think one thing to consider is that the United States is obviously the #1 destination for international students. It's close to 1 million international students who come here every year. So being that #1 destination, I think the expectations are very high in terms of what international students expect, how their experience will be once on campus. And obviously we need to provide those spaces and those support mechanisms, first of all, because it's the right thing to do. It's part of our mission, right? It's a coherence and alignment between what we're doing as universities and the democratic missions that we have as higher education institutions. There's obviously multiple benefits to the institutions themselves and to the community in terms of diversity and openness and tolerance, respect that we can all learn and grow by learning and understanding from each other, right? And obviously there's this, and I'll talk a little bit more about later, but there's also this factor about competitiveness, right? So higher education institutions should also care about international students' experience in the United States, because whether we like it or not, like it's in some fields like STEM, like close to 60% of the PhDs come from abroad, not from the United States. So there's definitely also an important issue in there. And there's always the financial implications, which again have, it's like a two-edged sword, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Next slide, please. So I want to share with you, there might be more ways, but 4 main ways in which I think international students are being commodified and dehumanized currently in the United States. And the first one was already mentioned by Dr. Yao, which is how it's very common and very often that we treat international students as a monolithic group. Like we talk about international students as a whole, when the reality is that it's a quite diverse group. And so that's the first way in which we tend to just commodify everyone, put it in the same bag, and treat them as individuals with the same needs, right? There's also, I think, there's a huge misalignment between how active are higher education institutions in the United States, particularly in recruiting international students, in bringing students, and then what happens, and with that, the amount of resources of support that are invested to support students once on campus. So I think that's also another way in which universities are probably not necessarily fulfilling their promise to international students. And I think one of the most recent ways that we've seen in the past, I don't know, 4 or 5 years mostly, but obviously this has been going on for many, many decades, is how international students keep being used as pawns in this huge geopolitical chess game that we are in currently. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about that and share some concrete examples about that. And then lastly, it's how often, every time we talk about international students and all the discourses around the benefits of supporting international students, of supporting immigration laws, of supporting universities, bringing more international students, there's always this kind of discourse in there between the lines of the ways in which we, the university, our domestic students value what international students bring. So it's always about this discourse on what we get from international students, and not necessarily a more reciprocal and mutual relationship. Next slide, please. So some examples, and again, I'll be quick with this one because Dr. Yao already mentioned it, but I think the first one is homogenization. International students are not a monolithic group at all. Like the only thing that they share might be, an immigration status, a type of visa that they have in this country, and that they at some point decided to leave their home country to study abroad. But other than that, motivations, past experiences, future goals, there are as many as the number of international students that we have, right? We cannot even group international students by country. We know that there's a lot of different intersecting factors that affect how students will experience life in the United States. It has to do a lot with issues like race, gender identity, language fluency, many different aspects, and the intersection of these aspects that will really shape the experience that international students will have in the United States and in our campuses. Next slide, please. But yet, one of the things that I've noticed is that most of the people here in this group, as student affairs practitioners, we have developed very sophisticated forms of organizing universities to support students, which is great. We have all these different offices, all the different departments to really attend to the needs of students overall, right, regardless of their immigration status. But the reality is that for international students, for the most part, they see a one-stop shop in international student services, and they might not necessarily be aware of all the other services that exist on campus and how to navigate those services. At the same time, these other offices and departments might not necessarily be always knowledgeable about the specific needs that an international student might have, how to reach out to students, how to help them transition and settling in their new campus. So even though we have all this infrastructure, sometimes it's not necessarily reaching international students the way it should be. So I think there's also a huge opportunity here to better use all of our student affairs infrastructure that we have and all the support mechanisms that we have on campuses, and also target those to international students. And I know that there's a bunch of very good practices that we share every year, but I still think that there's more that we can do to learn from other institutions, to learn from other areas within our campuses, and how can we better attend to the needs of international students. Next slide, please. And why do I think that this happens? And why do we keep struggling with the fact that sometimes international students are not able to navigate all these different areas on campus? Well, despite the fact that I mentioned that the US is the #1 destination country and that there's a lot of international students in this country, it's over 1 million, it's still not the majority on campus, right? So international students are still a minority when we see them as a group on campus. So it's very easy that for some institutions to lose sight of some of international students. And as I was saying before, if we start dividing international students and thinking of them not as a group but as individuals, then the needs of that group, it becomes like we cannot even count the specific needs that, because it's pretty much at the individual level. So sometimes it's very difficult to reach out and to understand how can we better support students who are struggling academically in terms of mental health, navigating the healthcare system, for example, all the different things that literature has already taught us that international students need more support from their institutions. So we need to understand that it's still there's still a lot to do, and there's a long way to go within our own universities. And I think there's some things that these kind of forums can really help us to disseminate more best practices and ways into which we can help international students to better adapt, but also ways in which we as universities can really understand and grow and learn some things from other places, from other individuals, and what can they share with us at the universities. Next slide, please. So in current times, I think one of the most important issues that we've been seeing is how international students keep being politicized. And there's a lot of roles that are ascribed to international students right now. And unfortunately, in the past decades or in the past few years, it's more common for governments, especially for some other areas outside universities, to really, they have really noticed how important is the flow of international students worldwide. So it's not just a US thing, right? So some of you might remember how a few years ago, it was probably in 2017, I think, when there was a huge conflict, diplomatic conflict between Saudi Arabia and Canada. And at the time, there were some declarations in which Saudi Arabia said, well, you know what, if we cannot settle this, then we'll just stop funding every international student that we have in Canada, which is a quite substantial number. So governments threatening another government to take out students from one country or another one, it's just a way of using people as political pawns, right? In this, as I was saying before, this huge geopolitical chess game in which the country, and I'm sorry, in which the world is currently living on. Then Dr. Yao also mentioned already how during the pandemic, as you all recall, for the fall of 2020, when we were talking about reopening campuses, most universities were thinking about reopening virtually or in hybrid models. And then the government said, well, yeah, no, you can't do that. Or if you do that, then your international students will have to go home because they cannot stay in the country if they're not taking 100% of their classes in person. And there was this declaration from someone who was from the Trump administration back then, who really admitted that it was a way of forcing universities to reopen, right? Because they wanted universities to be open for many political reasons. It spoke good about how the US was recovering, right, from COVID back then. So the fact that the government, again, is using the leverage of threatening international students' presence in a country to make other things happen, like using them as this form of soft and hard power, it's just amazing, but it's also at the same time very dehumanizing for international students and another way of how we commodify international students. Next slide, please. So another recent example, how international students are being used as hostages, political hostages, but also in some cases like even at least from this some of recent news, like real hostages, right? So in the picture on the right, even though it comes, and I know what the implications that this comes from a spokesperson at the Russian embassy in India, but the important thing is to keep in mind is the discourse, how Russia was probably without a lot of proof, but Russia was insinuating that Ukraine was using international students as hostages and as human shields to repel the attacks on Ukraine. So again, regardless of what these declarations can or cannot be proved, which we can probably doubt about them, the fact that the Prime Minister of India and the Russian President were speaking about how international students were used as hostages, it's a way in which international students are taking this political role or being manipulated politically by the governments. And the last example is also how a Democratic representative recently suggested that the United States should kick out Russian students just because they are from Russia. So again, we haven't learned a thing. Despite what the government of a country is doing, innocent international students who are studying abroad should not be punished and should not be penalized just by being members of a country, by having a passport from a certain country, right? It's not a lot of there's not a lot of difference between these kind of declarations and when the previous administration was talking about not letting students from Muslim majority countries into the country, right? Next slide, please. So I think the most important thing to keep in mind about international students and the commodification and the dehumanization is how we frame discourses around international education. I'm not going to go into too much detail about this slide, but this is an interview from a mayor of a city in the United States. It's a small city, but it's home to one of the top research universities in the country. And it's interesting how, again, framing of international students is always about the benefit and about what we get as communities, as cities, as universities from international students. And we always keep hearing these discourses about the finances, the financial implications that international students have. We also can see there's some people talking about the benefit that international students bring their diverse perspectives, and it's like a gift to us. So we need to take advantage of these diverse perspectives. And it's interesting how in this declaration, this person says, for our domestic students, right? So it's an invaluable experience for our domestic students. So these are our students, and the other ones are international students who just come here and can share these perspectives, right? And then in the last one, there's even conversations about how global competitors, other countries, are mining. So if we're talking about commodification, there's not many commodities more valued than minerals, right? So we're talking about mining talent, the talent pool that we as the United States, that person is saying, are working so hard to create, right? So it's important to keep these international students here. It's important to create immigration paths that are easier for international students because we need them. So again, this discourse, this framing matters. And the last slide that I want to share with you today, because I'm thinking I'm over time, it's pretty much the same thing in how framing matters. So even organizations that are really doing an amazing job in fostering understanding and lobbying policies for international students, they're not necessarily absent from these discourses that are appreciated in the sense that they are defending international students. In this case, for example, when that immigration scandal happened in 2020. But the way in which we defend the presence of international students, again, comes back to the $40 billion that they bring into the country, right? So there's this cartoon which says that international students, what are we? Are we part of the community, really? Or are we part of the economy, right? So I think it's important to keep in mind how we keep talking about international students on our campuses. What are the arguments that we're using to defend, to advance better conditions for international students? And just keep in mind that sometimes those can also be hurtful and commodifying and dehumanizing for international students. So thank you for your attention. And with that, I will pass it to Sergi.
Thank you. So I go to the next slide. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Yao, and thank Dr. Castillo for leading us to situate our contemporary international student issues and into this social historical context. So as an addition to this discussion of the equity-driven lens, I'd like to focus on some specific issues about Chinese international students and scholars in particular. China has been the leading source country of international students for the US over the past decade, but due to the escalating geopolitical tensions between the US and China, Chinese students and scholars are facing some specific challenges. So these challenges are definitely rooted in the historical ideology of yellow peril, as Dr. Yao mentioned. It is just that the discrimination against Chinese and Asian may take place in a different format under the current context. So next slide, please. So if you are working with Chinese international students, you are probably very familiar with a series of policies and regulations that just single out Chinese student scholars and portray them as a potential threat to the US national security. Since 2020, Chinese students and scholars who have military ties have been banned to enter the US under the Proclamation 10043. Each year, thousands of Chinese students and scholars are negatively affected. Also, the Department of Justice launched the China Initiative in 2018, arguing that the initiative focuses on protecting our critical infrastructure against external threats through foreign direct investment and supply chain compromises, as well as combating covert efforts to influence the American public and the policymakers without proper transparency. This initiative disproportionately targeted Chinese students and scholars and accused them of engaging academic espionage activities. So this initiative finally came to an end over a month ago. But looking back, ironically, none of the charges under the China Initiative over the past 3 years showed any evidence of spying from China, but had to do with administrative procedures and false reporting. Next slide, please. So in this political context, Dr. Jenny Lee and I collaborated with the Committee of 100, a nonprofit organization of Chinese Americans in the US. And we conducted a national survey among near 2,000 faculty, postdocs, and the graduate students in the STEM fields at the top US universities. Although this is not all about Chinese international students and scholars, but also those who are permanent residents and the US citizens, it still demonstrated a very concerning pattern that the Chinese students and scholars, regardless of their citizenship, feel targeted by the US government. Among the Chinese graduate student scholars who participated in the survey, 42% reported feeling racially profiled by the US government, and 51% felt fear, anxiety of being surveilled by the US government. This result shows that the impact of the Chinese initiative did not just ruin the lives of a small number of Chinese professors who actually faced charges, but also caused this anxiety and fear within the broad Chinese scientific community. If you're interested in this study, you can scan the QR code to access the full report. I wanted to just throw a question here for student affairs practitioners. So if the discriminative narrative that the Chinese are spies is crafted at the federal level, what can we do at institutional level to help our Chinese students and scholars? So I don't have an answer, but hope this helps to initiate the conversation. So next slide, please. So has the anti-China rhetoric at the federal level actually influenced what people think about Chinese? So from the same survey, we found that 44% of the non-Chinese participants believe that academic espionage and intellectual theft in academia among Chinese scientists was a serious issue. As we know that most of the prosecutions under the China Initiative were eventually dropped or dismissed. But unfortunately, we still observe these noticeable stereotypes against Chinese. Like one non-Asian professor commented, "I would qualify China as a scientific polluter." Anyone that is familiar with what goes on in Chinese universities understand that data is often fabricated. As a result, the Chinese do great damage to the scientific enterprise. Now the China Initiative has ended, but we don't know how long and to what extent such stereotypes will remain and how much that will continue to affect the day-to-day lives of Chinese students and scholars. So from here, that we may ask ourselves as student affairs practitioners, do we have those stereotypes ourselves? And how do the stereotypes in the mind of ourselves and the people around us affect our interactions with international students? Next one, please. So another consequence of the anti-China policies is that many Chinese graduate students and scholars actually consider leaving the US. So as a reference, by 2017, the 5-year stay rate of Chinese science and engineering doctoral recipients in the US was over 80%. However, in our survey, 42% of the Chinese scientists who were non-US citizens indicated that FBI investigations and or the China initiative affected their plans to stay in the US. For example, a Chinese graduate student said, before the China initiative was established, I have always been wanting to stay in the US for my career in academia. Now, after seeing so many Chinese scientists being wrongfully targeted with the added hatred towards China, Chinese people fueled by the COVID-19 pandemic and Donald Trump, I have decided not to pursue a long-term career in the US. So here comes the question for student affairs professionals. So why should we even care about international student post-graduation plans? So is our work complete once international students graduate from our institution? So if we care about their long-term career outcomes, is it because we believe that international students are the valuable talents to the US that US should retain? Or does it have anything to do with the future student recruitment? So although it's important to discuss how to provide career support for international students, we probably should take some time to review our values and perspectives in terms of why the fact that Chinese students and scholars consider leaving the US matters to us. Okay, so far I have raised a lot of questions regarding how to, in terms of supporting international students who are caught in the middle of the geopolitical tensions, not just about Chinese students, probably you can think about other students from other countries, like students from Russia, for example. So I really look forward to our conversation. But before that, I'm going to hand it back to Dr. Yao.
Yeah, so thank you everyone for sticking with us, and hopefully you found some nuggets of information that's helpful in the work that you do. And when the three of us, we were chatting and we're thinking about, well, what are the implications, right? Like, what does all of this mean? And, you know, in some of our conversation and in some of the work that we do is the recognition, and also, you know, some of the stuff that we talked about is that every campus is very, very different. And so we can't sit here and say, oh, this is what you need to do, right? And this is how you have to do your work, because every institutional context is very different. Your international student population is very, very different. Again, that socio-historical, right? That piece, like where your institution is located, the history of it, all of that, all affects, you know, the work that you do. And so in the next couple of slides, what we have here are just some considerations for you as you engage in the student affairs practice, right? Thinking about what are some of the theories and values that inform the work that we do, right? Thinking about whose experiences are centered or ignored in discussions of student support, who is presumed to benefit from international student mobility, what larger structures, system values, and histories are international students embedded within. And then the next slide, what practices that we engage in that may reify hegemonic discourse, or how do we, more importantly, how can we resist them in our work, right? Paying attention to things that we talk about in our department meetings, how we talk about the international student population. And also, you know, the question comes, can internationalization be used to reimagine and transform spaces of higher ed and student affairs for equity? And I think, you know, this is where that critical hope comes in, is that yes, we have to do it. So how can we actually do this work? Also, how can we, you know, enhance international students' engagement through student affairs programs and activities? Again, thinking about the slide that Dr. Castillo had about, you know, all these different offices around our campuses, and yet, you know, not very many campuses collaborate with the International Students and Scholars Office and think about, you know, what are ways that we can work together to better engage international students. And then also, finally, are student affairs practitioners prepared to better serve the needs of international students? And I actually wrote an article with a colleague probably a couple of years ago. And in our findings, the answer was a very big no, I'll be honest. I'm not sure it's changed a lot in the past couple of years. And this is me speaking as a faculty member and program director of a student affairs graduate preparation program that, that is one area I would say a lot of our grad prep programs are lacking, is how do we engage more in that global perspective? And I know it's something that we've been talking a lot about at my institution. How do we engage more, in thinking more broadly about diversity, equity, inclusion to include that global perspective and make it relevant for everybody. So I think I'm going to pause here, and I would actually welcome questions. I think you can pop them in the chat. You can unmute yourself and everything, I think also. So comments, questions, we'd also welcome feedback. I mean, this is work I think for the three of us we're going to continue doing. And so if you have feedback about anything we talked about, we would also love to hear it. I think there's a hand up. Dr. Huggins?
Yeah, I wanted to find out, do we look at the power that international students have? Or should we be looking at that and really exploring that? Because in terms of economics, it is important. So I am thinking we could flip the script and start looking at what is the power that international students have.
I'm going to send that to Dr. Castillo, who I know has been doing some work related to international students as agents, right? Is that correct? Yep.
Yeah, that's a very good question, a good reflection. Just as I was saying, how, for example, governments are aware of what means to have international students and how they can play around that. That's because precisely it's a valuable, right? There's power within. So it could be flipped, and it could be an opportunity for international students to say like, hey, we can use this power that we have, but we also have to be very cautious in terms of what does that mean for the students as individuals to exercise that kind of power, collective power, because it demands a lot of courage, because typically you have everything against you. You're a visitor in a foreign country. So there's also this tension between to what extent do we become activists and for ourselves and start advocating for ourselves using the power that we know we have, and I say we as a former international student, but also the risk, in what does that mean? What could be the consequences, particularly for the individuals at that time? That you might be, exercising or enhancing some future changes, but in the short term, there's a lot of risk for students. That's one way to also think about and consider it. But the other thing is that there are many ways in which international students are exercising their agency and into, at least bringing awareness to many of the issues that they're facing. And I think the challenge lies precisely in that, in how can we make those cases not like very individual and more organized and more so that they can be stronger cases of agency being exercised to really change things and change the situation. But yeah, that's a very good point, that there's a lot of power that international students hold, and that's why precisely they're being used as pawns, as hostages, etc.
I'll also touch a little bit on the piece about that Dr. Castillo brought up about, activism, right? But within certain confines. I mean, the reality is that, well, so I'm actually in the middle of a project right now where a lot of the students international students I talk to, and talking to them, for example, after George Floyd's murder, about a lot of the protests that were going on, about the Black Lives Matter movement, and every single one was like, I absolutely did not go to a protest. I will not go in person to one. And the reason is because I cannot be deported. I cannot be arrested and everything. And so I think there's also a role as student affairs professionals, also as faculty, just as an institution, is to be able to talk to our students and say, hey, these are your rights and responsibilities as a student. Right? These are your rights and responsibilities on campus. These are your rights and responsibilities of what may happen off campus. And just making it very clear that there could be some repercussions, but at the same time, we talk a lot about, college is the time to explore, college is the time to realize, to stand up for what you believe in and everything. So we have to make sure that we have those pathways for all of our students, right? So that they feel safe and secure being able to do that. I think there is a question in here from Kelber's iPad. And are colleges and universities developing policy to invite international students in higher education program to feel included in the curriculum, as well as connected them to job opportunities in their own campus post-graduation? I feel like the rhetoric does not apply to their own context as well. Do any of you, Santiago, Xiaojie, do y'all want to take that? Or I can jump in for, oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Christina.
Yeah, so I would actually say, I don't know, I wouldn't say that higher ed institutions and programs, I don't think they're developing policies, right, to invite international students in higher programs to feel included in the curriculum and everything. I can say, you know, in my institution, it is something that we've had a lot of conversation about, and even some conversations we've had, like I had at the other student affairs conference that was a few weeks ago with some of the other faculty and program directors of, you know, ethically having conversations about ethically, you know, we are encouraged to recruit international students to attend our graduate programs. And I'll talk about student affairs in particular, but we also know that it is very difficult to get a job as a student affairs professional after you get your master's degree within the United States, right? Because most universities, not all, most universities will not sponsor international students and scholars, right, as employees and everything. And so, you know, and then we're also kind of like, well, I mean, we're training people within the US context. And then if you go back home to your home country, like student affairs never looks the same anywhere else, right? Student affairs looks very different everywhere else. And so I won't say that we come to a conclusion or that we have any great practices in place, but it is a conversation I know that many of us are having, that ethically, how are we doing this work? Why are we doing this work? And who is harmed within this and everything, right? Because we're getting pushed to like, oh, you need to enroll more students. And also everybody loves to enroll more international students. It shows how global your program is and everything. But again, the ethics of, all right, you come here for 2 years, you get this degree, and then what, right? And so definitely this is something that we need to talk a lot more about. Santiago, I'll pass it back to you.
Yeah, no, I was going to say pretty much the same thing. And I can speak from experience. As someone who graduated from a higher education program, being an international student at the time, I've always considered myself as a scholar practitioner. But I knew that the practitioner side of the equation was going to be very difficult for me here in this country, because most of the positions within any higher education institution that are practitioner oriented won't sponsor the visa for an international person, as opposed to, for example, faculty positions, which are a little bit easier for universities to hire people from overseas. But yeah, I think that comment from Kelber is very, very pertinent, because as universities, I don't know if there's any, I think there's more that we can be doing, because we identify these issues, we talk about these issues, but at the same time, we're not doing enough, I think, to address them. So yeah, I think there's still a room for improvement there, especially in terms of, like, I know that sometimes it's difficult for universities to hire their own graduates, but I think in the areas, particularly like student affairs, I think it makes sense. It makes a lot of sense to hire your own graduates. So again, if we're talking about how there's a lack of this feeling and global competencies is within our student affairs practitioners, and if you're preparing someone who already brings those competencies with them, and now it's prepared in the practice of student affairs or international affairs, why not give them a shot? Why not give them an opportunity? And for the most part, there's some studies that have said that international students, for the most part, wouldn't mind staying in the United States in the same community, because you're already creating roots in the community where you are living, where you studied a master's or a PhD or whatever. So I think that's a conversation that's worth having with leadership within higher education institutions as well.
So I was working as a student affairs practitioner, as an international, even though not about my visa type, but I still identify myself as international. So I do feel like when my workplace, people are not so used to have international people in this field, so they may not trust you as much as they trust other coworkers. I think that's a thing. So our policies, not practices, are not there yet, as Dr. Yao mentioned. And also I think the whole field is not really ready, even not ready to recognize the unique values those people can bring. So that creates another challenge for us to hire international students after they graduate.
I think I saw somebody's hand pop up. Are you still on here?
Yeah, it was just a comment, like I've been through the process, like English, undergrad, grad, and applying for visas and all. And like Dr. Yao says, like they use us as like, oh, we're global, we welcome you, and we don't get enough information because like I'm originally from Brazil, so coming from Brazil was just like, oh, I got enough. So to just enroll and be a student, but like after this, what's going to happen to me? Like you said, like you build a community, you have friends, sometimes you have partners, and it's just like, now it's time for me to go after all these years. And then like my experience with my international office was not pleasant. It was just like, yeah, it's time for you to go. And it's like, okay. So I think it's more like how during that time that we hear, we educate ourselves, but people like, hey, it's time for you to look into this, you know, it's time for you, because we don't know. Like I know a lot of things, it's still in my job today. I know a lot of things that about retirement, about my country, about applying, like investing money in my country. But like here, it's really hard for me. I need to like work, like I believe 3 times harder to understand and have this information, because I don't have resources that actually help me with that. So yeah, it's just like after you hear, still having that process of not holding your hand, but like giving you the support to maintain your status after you finish your time with the university that you decide to study. Yeah.
Great, thank you. We have another question from Samaya. I hope I pronounced your name right, and if I'm wrong, please tell me. Where can higher education graduates facing the barriers and getting sponsored turn to for support? I think that's a great question. And I think it also leads into the next question from Elise about, who works in career services. When we have partnered with ISSS or similar offices before, there is a sense that advising international students on career planning has very high stakes because of possible visa implications. So we should always refer them back to ISSS for final information. How can we balance those high stakes of mistakes with the need for all offices to support international students? Anybody want to take these first?
I can share that. Well, first of all, I completely agree with Tay, who was responding to Samaya, that obviously having a network is always super useful. In my case, that's been the case as well. Knowing others who have gone through the immigration processes, who can share. But then the interesting thing about that is that there's all this knowledge that's being passed through like inner circles of international students. How come we have not documented that in better ways within our own programs? So for example, I remember having kind of like this conversation with my department, saying like, as an international student, I had to go through all of this and learn pretty much all of this by myself. Basic things like, for example, even healthcare for dependents, which was something that I couldn't understand at the beginning. So how can we make sure that our own departments, at least, if not the larger university, gets to document all these learnings from other international students and pass them to future generations? That's something that we also need to consider. But I think the most important part is the larger picture, the systemic way in which universities can actually start ensuring that they can pass along that information. So that comment on how can career services and international student services better communicate. I think the issue is not about sending students back and forth within career services and international student services. If you ask me, if I'm looking for career advice and I want to learn about how to apply for positions and everything, that's something that career services should take a lead on, even the immigration part. So how come we have, again, prepared our international student services offices to understand what an F1 visa means, what an H1B visa means, but we are not doing the same thing with our career services people? So I think instead of bouncing the student back and forth within different areas, I think we could do a better job in understanding how some processes work ourselves, going to ISS, hey, teach me about this so I can better advise my own students who come and ask, and they happen to need a visa or have questions about immigration, but that's more related to the job market, which is something that falls more onto career services. Because again, we see international student services as a one-stop shop, but it's also impossible to believe that an international student advisor will be knowledgeable about everything just because that person happens to have a visa, right? That's why we have a different offices within our universities, right? To specialized people.
I absolutely agree. And I think there's a must for career services department to have somebody specializing in international student immigration issues. And that's, I think it's a must. But however, that I don't really see that really happening in all universities. And if we don't really understand the specific challenges or issues that international students are facing, how can we advise in terms of their careers? So they kind of left it out there without any support. So I think that's where we probably should start with. I totally agree with what Dr. Castillo said.
I think also the one thing I'll add, because I know we're running out of time, is it goes beyond just training, right? Because to a certain extent, we can't, well, I don't think we can expect every single student affairs professional on campus to understand, legal visa issues and everything. Because honestly, they change, right? They change depending on the president, depending on the president's feelings that week, depending on what's going on around the world and stuff, right? And so in that sense, so what are ways that we can think about how do we collaborate more in a way where, maybe if you're saying, all right, for this week, we're going to have, targeted advising sessions related to career advising. When you make an appointment with us, we will also have somebody from the ISS office with us, right? So maybe, and again, we learned in the pandemic, we can do our jobs in very different ways and we can reimagine how we do things. So maybe a career advising appointment is not just with a career advisor, but it's with a career advisor and somebody from the ISS office who can also simultaneously give that information about, all right, these are things to think about, these are considerations, and then the career advisor and then the ISS advisor being like, okay, but these are also the technical things, right? These are the legal things. So thinking about how do we develop you, give you that help that you need related to this issue, but also these are the other legal considerations you have to make. That's just a very quick example, but I think there's ways that we can rethink. We can't just keep doing things the way that we've always done it, right? We also can't expect people to take on additional trainings over and over and over every time there's a new immigration update and stuff, right? We should, but there's not enough time. We don't have enough people working on our campuses. So how do we work together, right? How do we do this collaboratively? How do we make sure that whatever we need to do, let's work on this together and address what our expertise is, right? But maybe in one setting and one environment with a student. Okay, sorry, I think we went a little bit over. I think I'm passing it back over to...
Yes, to me.
Okay.
To me. Okay, so yes, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today in our first session. And so just a quick wrap up. We wanted to say, thank you for joining our session. We'll have 4 sessions in our series. So these are some of the dates. We have one coming up next week. And so feel free to stay tuned. And as for the certificate for completion, if you attend at least 3 out of the 4 sessions, whether that's like via live or via recording, that will be sent out to all registered participants. You just have to fill out the certificate sign up each time for each session, okay? So you have to do multiple. The link is already posted in the chat, and you can also scan the QR code here as well. And if you wanted to learn more about our commission, feel free to check out our link tree. All of the social media platforms and all of the upcoming events will be posted there. So yes, thank you everyone so much for joining. We'll be wrapping this up. So thank you so much to our presenters as well for, kicking us off in our series today. So thank you, everyone.